Hello everyone, today we talk about a very special figure, William Marshal, the first Earl of Pembroke. I'm experimenting with this new sort of biographical series dedicated to great commanders, rulers. We will insert saints at some point. We will see how to bear this depending on the character's importance and the general sort of observations across all the estates of medieval Europe. William Marshal being one of the most renowned knightly figures. I'm going as far as saying that he was the greatest knight in history. All right, this is a statement that I don't want to say dismantle because definitely if anyone can arrive to that sort of kind of level, so to say, of appreciation, well, William Marshal definitely earned that height as a whole. We just don't know that we should analyze, of course, this is just a historiographical anecdote, but he definitely incarnated the soul of chivalry, something that I shall make more videos on in a strictly theological sense of holy war, and that in part today we will look through William Marshal's life. There will be naturally much more to say about him, but I tried to condensate as much information as possible to properly profile his biography, and that's what we'll be going by. All right. Besides, it's always a pleasure to talk about medieval England, medieval English warfare, talking a bit more like the evenemential, the military side of the story, ad personam, like in this case, which is what, let's say, historiographical fashion tendency has not habituated us more than much to do. It's only through the lives of these men that we can appreciate at the fullest the plenitude of those times, morality, culture, personality, and tradition. Naturally, there are different historiographical and also philological issues here. We don't know everything we would like to know about William Marshal's life. He was born around 1146 or 47. Precise birthplace as well remains uncertain, though probably this was either Wiltshire or Berkshire in England. William Marshal went by the name of William le Marchal in Norman French, and Guillaume le Marchal in standard, also modern if you want, Languedoc. He entered the world as the fourth son to John Fitzgilbert, better remembered as John Marshal, who belonged to the lesser ranks of English nobility, closely tied to the Plantagenet clientele circle, and to John's second spouse, Sibylla of Salisbury, the sibling of Patrick, recognized as the first Earl of Salisbury. This is important because literally Anglo-Norman England was still largely in theory, right, and to an extent was an importantly wide frontier, as well as we'll see also with the Anglo-Irish connection. The Marshal lineage's inherited position as Marshal traced back to William's paternal father, Gilbert le Maréchal, whose ancestors among the Normans had accompanied the same William I, the Conqueror, during the invasion of England of 1066, and who had acted as Marshal on that occasion, so that basically an attendant tasked with attending to the royal horses that naturally required an incredibly high equestrian zootechnical skill in the service of King Henry I's Beauclerc's court. Over time, by the era of John, this duty had, by the way, advanced to a position as chief or master marshal, which involved essentially a position of higher command, overseeing fellow marshals that retained also part of the previous function, because these men were most like the mounted elite. The mounted elite's leadership, and as such they had to take care of an important degree, not just of commanding or strictly strategical issues, but logistical, organizational ones, as well as various officials within the king's entourage in general. So a political figure, if anything, feeling the pulse, let's say, of the political situation, understanding what was the general military quality of the king's forces at the moment. Although a good deal of the work got handed off to dedicated deputies as well, also because England is, of course, a pretty big, powerful realm that needs an adequately regional scaled military force. And there isn't just one figure that controls everything. Much passes through his wisdom and expertise, in line with transformations in additional aspects of royal duties. I made some videos about the political institutional development of medieval England. We have to talk a bit more about the Anglo-Normans. And in general, here, William Marshal, even in the Plantagenet era, of course, is, because these overlap at the end of the day, and even much more widely than commonly, at least pictured, if one sticks to the didactical chronologies. At the outset, John Marshal backed King Stephen when the latter grabbed the crown in 1135, yet by roughly 4 years later, he shifted his support to the competing pretender, Empress Matilda, the bereaved spouse of the German Emperor Henry V, and offspring of Henry I of England, to aid her in her contest for the succession against Stephen, an action that triggered England's descent into a 15-year internal strife called the Anarchy. I made a video about, if anything, the Anglo-Norman England, the Plantagenets. We talked about the Civil War. We also looked at Henry I's knightly retinues, especially in Normandy. So we have already profiled this phase that, because of the war, is marked by rampant disorder, fluctuating allegiances from the nobility, and constant clashes that eroded what had been established by the Normans actually as a pretty consistently centralized power, as well as the foundation of feudal order as the Anglo-Normans had fundamentally arranged them across the Channel. It's a struggle following the pattern also of older sort of Mercian versus sort of more southern English regional partitions. Witnessed the intervention also of the Celtic fringe in favor of the rebels and so on. In any case, during the 1152 siege of Newbury Castle under John Marshal's control, this was William's father, by Stephen, the monarch called for capitulation and seized the boy William, that at the time was only 5 or 6, to guarantee obedience, thus pausing the attack to the castle thus allowing negotiations to proceed. Instead, John took advantage of the break to bolster the fortress's protections and call up troops loyal to Matilda, breaking the deal. As Stephen delivered a final demand, warning he would execute the lad, John responded with chilling indifference, stating he felt no concern, and proclaiming, quote, "I still have the hammer and the anvil with which to forge still more and better sons." All right. And this was a sharp comeback that revealed the cold-blooded realism of politics in the Anarchy period, in which ties of family gave way to demands of tactics. And this was what was expected of a man that naturally was to always pursue victory, right? And this was undeniably a great lesson to William that, as it's evident, without too much spoiling, survived all this. In that proper chivalric enterprise, it was a metaphysical struggle of self-sacrifice in holy war. And this is true if you consider in that sense also John's offspring being essentially just an extension of his own imperium. This is not the only instance, by the way, that similar things happen, similar phrases were pronounced even by women at some point. We'll talk about that in the Renaissance. There's a pretty beautiful example of it, saying more or less the same thing. I've got the mold to make other children as these were being treated from of slaughter just in front of her eyes during the siege. What ensued was a staged hanging that surely would have left a mark. In fact, complete with setups to hurl the young William via a perrière, so literally a sort of form of trebuchet of catapult that therefore would have launched towards and destroyed against the boy against the fortress's ramparts. Yet Stephen, whether out of pity or shrewdness, found himself unable to injure the youngster and let him leave instead. These were, by the way, almost the years of Barbarossa's siege of Milan, where actual hostages were properly placed in front of the siege towers as they were approaching the ramparts. And of course, the Milanese did not hesitate to bombard the engines and killing their own, because this was the sort of strategic necessity of that, but for telling how sort of normal, even in that mindset, districts were. Not that humans suffered less, but they also had much more of a backbone to regularly withstand it, or to be expected to do so. Consider that there are, of course, some moral concerns, even especially considering the importance of nobility, of chivalry in all this. So the execution of such blood for a tactical purpose is not that of course rewarding, but it was worth trying, at least letting the father definitely worry about that until the last. For several months afterward, William remained a hostage under the crown, his endurance through the turmoil standing as a symbol of how risky early years were for children of the nobility in that time. Right, when biological survival took precedence at birth, but climbing the social ladder stayed riddled with high rates of child deaths and the hazards of feudal life. And these men had the weight of the world on their shoulders. Right, we will see that now. I made also some videos explaining the psychology of knighthood exactly during this period and what these men were psychophysically molded like. William's freedom arrived alongside the truce established at Winchester on November 6, 1153, which concluded the civil strife and cleared the path for Henry II, Matilda's offspring, to take up his roles as Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, before ascending as England's king in 1154, thereby restoring order to the kingdom following prolonged ruin. Besides being an aristocrat, was not immune from an enormity of concerns regarding probably the most concrete material issues. Being a junior son from a low-tier noble family, with nothing in terms of estates or wealth coming his way, given his older half-siblings Gilbert and Walter from John's prior union, plus his full siblings John and Henry positioned before him in the line of inheritance, William confronted, as a cadet, the typical fate of a spare, depending on his own abilities for progress, be it via military exploit, as an errant knight, or a life in the church, which would have at least spared you in part from some deadly enterprises. With the warrior route, however, selected for him within a culture where the rule of primogeniture directed the family assets, that is to say, financial assets, legal domains, guardianship of unmarried women, the protection on women historically, by essentially juridical possession of their mundum, pacts and prestige, to the first-born to sustain the bloodline, leaving the younger sons as possible rivals or liabilities. When William hit about 12 years old, coinciding with his dad's declining status during the reshufflings after the Anarchy, by the way, William got sent off to the castle of Tancarville. This was a key Norman fortress, properly meaning in Normandy, to serve as a page in the home of William of Tancarville, an influential lord, in fact, England's chamberlain, and a cousin on his mother's side via Sibylla, who bore the passed-down role of chief chamberlain to the Duke of Normandy herself, interestingly enough. In that setting, guided by this elder knight, who took on fatherly obligations, because there was probably an adoption, a fostering at least, an adoption, if anything, as a master, as a teacher, that entailed, by the way, an enormous deal of responsibility. In Reading the young nobleman for knighthood. That probably was the initiation rite, was essentially a second birth, and the one into proper manhood, enshrined by the sacred order of the military devotion. A duty that makes guidance the creation of ties of vassalage as well, because you were depending on this guy's imperium for your protection, thus for your life. William started the aforementioned intense preparation for knighthood, covering scriptural tales, recitations in Latin for prayers, deep dives into French tales of romance, that we also made videos on explaining the traditional military and religious meaning, to embed ideals of chivalry such as largesse, prowess, and débonnaire, so some sort of munificence, prowess, courtesy. These are mistranslated, let's say, in the deeper sort of semantic and etymological essence that they mean. At some point, if anything, we'll talk more and better about them. But alongside, however, hands-on practicing riding horses, pretty risky business, all right, wielding weapons, same, and general strategy and tactic, combat. This happened in incredibly dark fashion. As you've seen, William's early years hadn't been the most tranquil already, but this training was brutally and traumatically intense and had probably to forge the knight that William Marshal would become, according to whom probably the greatest knight ever. Beyond that, the Tancarville household taught him the intricacies of court intrigue, including how to handle partnerships and conflicts, although William's biography from the 13th century, L'Histoire de Guillaume le Marshal, put together by his oldest son, as we will see in the end, were around 1226, right, spanning over 19,000 lines in Anglo-Norman verse using octosyllabic rhymed pairs crafted by the poet Jean, and based on accounts from William's attendant Jean d'Herly, also called Jean d'Herly. His most trusted comrade in combat, so eyewitness to William's exploit and prowess, describes foes at Tancarville scheming against William, probably fellow youths jealous of his nearness to the powerful figure, by the way, which points to the scheming atmosphere inside noble entourages, but probably within the same retinues these kids were raised into ruthless killing machines, where gaining preference could invite danger in such already pretty terrible environment, also in a positive sense. William received his knighting in 1166 while participating in a military effort in Upper Normandy, which faced an assault at the time from the Count of Flanders. With Henry II's army, so these are the English, the Anglo-Normans pushing back the raids to protect the duchy. I made some videos around the Battle of Bourg-de-Rue, but we'll come back on Anglo-Norman war. We'll talk more also of the relations with with Flanders, with Brittany, right? Because this whole world, together with the Ile-de-France and beyond, is very much like considered the cradle of feudalism, of chivalry, of knighthood, of tournaments at a higher level in Europe that is actually imitating this region. And so these men are properly molded in this quite hot cauldron. And you have, at this point, for William, likely not the first, probably the baptism of fire, but the first taste of real fighting. That, by the way, drew mixed reviews. The Histoire, that we'll be following also as a biography of William, speaks of widespread praise for William's courageous actions, with observers confirming that he performed admirably amid the battle. But as modern scholarship pointed out, combat in the Middle Ages makes reputation with gain as well, and William stumbled on the financial side. It was very important for a man of his rank and ambition, if anything, neglecting to claim payments or spoils from defeated enemies even after his successes in the field, a lapse that makes his triumphs with practical letdown. As we will see, William will actually make up for that in his life. We also have to try and fail, by the way, to imagine what such experience really was. Today we read it as if it was a story, but this was properly a metaphysical injection into another dimension. What happened on the battlefields was connected with all what this man's preparation and exaltation and indoctrination was all about, right? This is lost, unfortunately, to history in its details, but it would have happened for all of them. In l'Histoire, the Earl of Essex, expecting the usual share from his brave underling, teased him. Quote, "Oh, but Marshal, what are you saying? You had 40 or 60 of them, yet you refused me so small a thing." Which was a witty remark, highlighting the financial side of 12th century knighthood, in which deeds of arms paid for one's standing as well. The following year, in 1167, with the backing from William of Tancarville for his first tourney, they made multiple videos on, especially last year, to explain what a tournament concretely was, especially in this early age, that is to say, essentially barely a mock combat. Actually, these were combats like all the others, right? They were just only towards this year, the third quarter of the 12th century, to sort of gradually institutionalize, becoming sort of a bit less bloody, right? This was actual chaotic, in part mock, but still combat in the style of a melee, stretching over countryside around settlements, ravaging it in the process, by the way, drawing hundreds of participants into dangerous, reward-rich clashes for probably capturing one another. That at some point, famously enough, the Third Lateran Council of 1171 had denounced for their deadliness. And so, if anything, for the waste of the fort, there was a struggle against Islam, against the enemies of the faith, of heretics, etc. So these tournaments from one side were considered a waste of energies and time. From the other, they were necessary for informing those extraordinary levels, especially of collective training, that Western knighthood properly achieved at this point. So it was all actually blended. Like, it's not really true that the church ever thought to ban things like, I don't know, the same tournaments, the crossbow. It's a slight misunderstanding that was more like, okay, let's turn this against, in a more participative sense, against the infidels, in fact, the true enemies of Christendom, rather than fighting with one another. And it is exactly in the tournament, however, that William found his true calling, right? Earning also much of his, in fact, knightly and equestrian reputation, sharpening abilities that would make him a top victor, Also, the tournament was, as we've seen, a pretty high evenience, right? William would have probably not participated up to, I've seen he had just been knighted, basically, and so even the first tournament was important as the first battle in practice. Building riches via payments for prisoners, captured steeds that were traumatically expensive, and gear that also was really worth it during an epoch short of ready money. So this was a way to cash fast, in a time where, general economical surplus was ridiculous compared to pre-industrial standards. A peasant could work his entire life and basically not even properly sensing how much he would have augmented from the amount of resources he had started at the beginning of his life of work. Come 1168, William moved into the service of his uncle on his mother's side, Patrick, the Earl of Salisbury, a close associate of Henry II, whose good graces placed his followers within reach of the king amid the bustling Angevin realm. The same year, later on, Patrick accompanied Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, spouse to Henry II, ex-Queen of France and Duchess of Aquitaine, on a trip along the edges of her territory to suppress disturbances. And William formed a core part of the protective detail. Near Poitiers, they fell into an ambush set by Guy de Lusignan, original baron aiming to nab Eleanor for bargaining power, which broke the party apart. In fact, Eleanor got away without injury, thanks also to her escort and the sacrifice of its men. Patrick fell in the fight, right? Bitterly enough for William, who was severely struck in the thigh as he shielded the same queen. William got captured on this occasion and transported to a Lusignan stronghold to await payoff for his release. There, a nameless gesture of kindness, a loaf hiding strips of fresh linen for wrapping wounds, probably prevented the very common as deadly sepsis, allowing William to hold on until Eleanor, impressed by tales of his courage, covered the fee and outfitted him completely as a warrior, bringing him into her circle for the next pair of years. I made a video about medieval Aquitaine. We obviously talked about Eleanor. She could be part of our biographical series because, as you know, she was an extraordinary woman whose courts at some point, even, but well, mostly from the English offspring, Henry II, in fact, spread talented knights, leaders, and composers, right, in the older tradition of the warrior bard, right, of the Minnesänger, of the Stilnov, that expressed what is beautiful, like the peak of male crime at the time, usefully channeled in warfare, as much as, in fact, the peak of male creativity, inspired to the highest imperial tradition. Within Eleanor's court, William took part in tourneys, polishing his reputation for chivalry, with his devotion to the queen shown through his self-sacrificing bravery, fitting the period's moral standards under which faithfulness to superiors and noble women heightened one's esteem. This is a bit like the Rex Nemorensis. The ideal is, like Lancelot, to essentially win over the soul, essentially the king's wife as the soul of chivalry, and nothing else than winged glory and the Holy Ghost as the prize of his for his exploit in achieving essentially world domination. But we will talk more and better about this. Much of this was naturally just at this point, hoped for, but there was a veritable competition for especially marriage with a rich heiress, also because usually these women married very early and very young compared to their husbands, who had the habit of dying early, given all this incredibly bloody lifestyle. And so there was a veritable chance of social promotion for not just the erotic attire alone. In 1170, aware of his hair's greenness, we're talking here Henry II towards his son Henry the Young King, the English monarch appointed William as arms instructor and household, the main guide, to Henry. That at the time was 15-year-old. He wouldn't have only William as a trainer in that regard. Philip of Alsace was a great figure, a veteran of the wars of the Lombard League under Frederick Barbarossa, and one of the most unprejudiced and pioneering tournament organizers of his era. We'll talk more about him at some point. We're talking probably the peak, like the highest sum of chivalry, of knighthood. This is probably the age, like, of that mirage, that moment of superimposition of the older traditional practical lifestyle with the later sort of more modern theoretical one, that after the lock of knighthood and nobility in the process. Henry the Young King had been crowned as joint ruler that year at Westminster under special papal approval to secure Henry's succession, even though he lacked real power. So it was a symbolic promotion to stir bitterness as well. William's responsibilities were thus very, very tough, involving teaching skills of chivalry, offering guidance in general as a mentor, as a tutor, not just as a trainer, and providing armed protection as well, right? An all-round life coach and protector, elevating the same William, however, in this way, to the top of the royal household. I mean, you're literally given the future King of England, which will not be, unfortunately for him, under your wing, right? From which, in fact, William oversaw the jeunesse, right? A circle of young and attached knights around the prince, by the way. So this other retinue of hotheads now the same. I mean, as you understand here, William is fairly young himself, but people age faster in also proper, as we've seen here, axe-bitten fashion, nurturing a brotherhood of warriors that naturally looked up to this myth that William was de facto already becoming. In the course of the 1173-74 revolt, during which young Henry, aided by siblings Richard and Geoffroy, and supported by Francis Louis VII, along with Scotland's William the Lion, rebelled over their father's grip on inheritance, portions, and income. William stayed true to his charge. Details of his specific involvements are actually unclear, but his commitment firm through the Angevin family conflict that tore through Normandy and England. Here, as you understand, Louis VII of France was the former husband of Eleanor, the Queen Mother, and of England now. And you understand here this is the usual revolt here involving the same offspring. There were pretty strong issues also between, like, factionalism within the same family, father, mother, and foreign powers interfering. After the uprising ended with the 1174 Treaty of Montlouis, which imposed oaths and penalties, young Henry and his followers, William included, trailed Henry II for a year and a half in a wandering phase of mending fences until appeals from the Pope and his mother won permission for tourneying on the continent, a controlled way to channel the heir's drive, right? Because this was probably the moment of exploit to prove themselves, just as William had previously done himself. Between 1176 and 1182, William trailed young Henry through the tournament scene in northern France, ranging from Passy-sur-l'Eure to Bonneval and Gournay, gathering a company of knights, accurately selected on the base of prowess and victory, frequently teaming up with the Fleming Roger de Gauchy, turning early losses into unbeatable success via tight-knit strategies, taking more than 500 opponents over his career, William's career proper, according to his recollections on his deathbed, reaping huge sums from ransoms as a consequence, reaching up to, 100 marks for each knight, plus horses and tack, which supported generous giving that captured the spirit of chivalry. These tourneys, enormous and lethal affairs, as we have described them, across long courses that swallowed up villages, that caused dramatic economic damage at a local level, combined play with mock war frowned upon by the church, as we've seen, but central to elite society. Actually useful in reenacting, essentially, the actual warfare of the year, if anything, because differently from contemporary enacting, they actually killed one another, they actually broke each other's bones, spines, they lost a hell of bone in the process, etc. And in which William's skill at feats like toppling Baldwin I, the Count of Guines. This is I never told this anecdote, but I'm incredibly connected with Baldwin I, Count of Guines, since I was little, and that's something I never really discussed on the channel. It sort of, struck me now. In famed episodes, by the way, brought William's renown as, in fact, the Marshal, hinting at the eventual merging with the earldom. Back in 1173, as the rebellion kicked off, young Henry, who had already been dubbed a knight by his dad, asked William to redub him, with the latter sent un nouveau de l'épée d'Ambrace, the prince, a ceremonial reknighting that stood for manly entry into the order of knights, sidestepping standard customs where different rulers, such as Overlord Louis VII, could perform it. The embrace and grip of hands cemented their closeness, positioning William as stand-in father in matters of combat. This is incredibly important because, according to tradition, this initiation, right, in this case, this knighting into holy war is soul transfiguring, and so there is a level of spiritual fatherhood impressed on the young Henry that, in his wish and evaluation, surpassed in William the same King of England. All right. By the end of 1182, William lingered as an unmarried bachelor with the household's youthful group. This we explained in the video about the Norman Knights of Henry I. Right, it was properly a sort of youth that corresponded, in fact, to the one of knightly life. That, in the case of William, was particularly long. Usually, knights settled down, just married. So this, as we've seen, was also not just a matrimonial, but a patrimonial move. And this hadn't been the case with William, that had, however, in exchange, earned, as we've seen, a skyrocketing reputation in his military status. He had been enjoying young Henry's high regard, but 5 knights from Normandy bitter over his rise as an Anglo-Norman. And this divide existed also within properly the Anglo-Norman, the Angevin, the Plantagenet rule between the two sides of the channel. And his command of the Tournai fields as well, because there would always be an opposition, right, grumbled, quote, this is according to the story, "We are all bastardized if we let this Englishman checkmate us." Right, the French naturally thought to be the greatest people in the world. The Franks that had received probably the imperium from God, but seizing essentially Rome as such, receiving the same papal blessing, this Catholic plenitude. I talked about this in multiple videos, including the ones of the chanson de geste that would have resonated, in fact, in this very environment, to stifle military commitment as translatio imperii proper. So it was a strongly felt ethnic, racial divide, right, along these national patterns. And so this subgroup plotted together, spreading lies of an affair of William with the princess consort that was Margaret of France, the daughter of Louis VII. Right, as we've seen here, Henry the Young Prince had been sent over to France to properly learn from there the craft of war. So they had mostly remained within this French-dominated circle, regardless of the fact that, again, they were Anglo-Normans in a good part, but had gathered, as we've seen, people also from other countries. Scholarly views of this accusation range from the being invented by opponents to being truthful. Right, it's impossible to confirm, but what matters is that at the time they would have been hurtful. All the same, they may have covered a charge of offense against majesty stemming from William's overbearing pride and greed, with the infidelity claim serving as a cover, especially in l'histoire, that is naturally positive towards William for deeper money-related wrongs. God knows what kind of feuds and brutality existed in this very strongly violent and ambitious circles. Brought before young Henry for judgment, William suggested a duel under God's verdict through a proxy fight, essentially to prove his purity. They really believed things to proceed that way through the Holy Ghost as the Imperium on the field. But doubts won out, leading to William's dismissal from duty in early 1183. So at that point, he was left roaming the tourney circuit, piling up riches while spending freely as well. His fame pulling in invitations from hosts eager to boost their gatherings, as well as having a sizable retinue on his own. In January 1183, young Henry, having patched things up with his father against his brother Richard's advances into Poitou, launched a campaign with Henry II siding with Richard. This is yet another clash among the Angevins. By May, absolved of the charges, William came back into the fold, only for the prince to succumb to dysentery on June 11, 1183, close to Martel Castle in Touraine, an old memory of the Frankish victory over the Arabs, where from his sickbed he urged William to stand in for his 1182 pledge to crusade by assuming the cross for Jerusalem, once his father forgave him. This is quite touching in many ways, especially considering what the Holy Citadel were represented in the mind of these men, and just think having a royal blood and this higher sense of knighthood connected with transfiguration and fame and power and glory. After guiding the funeral procession to Rouen for burial in the Cathedral of Notre Dame, William set out late in 1183 toward the Holy Land, honoring the promise across 2 years, the fine points of which escape the otherwise thorough coverage of l'histoire. This is particularly relevant because of not just what he had promised to this almost adoptive son of royal blood, but because of his connection, later connections with the monastic military orders. In fact, William completed the sacred pilgrimage privately pledging to join the Templars upon his hand. This is a speculation that Georges Duby made at some point. We will reflect on this at the end, especially when we'll cover William's last thoughts. And this was to keep the promise under wraps at William's choice, or as others frame it, against the backdrop of the Latin East's pressing needs in 1184, like aiding the relief of Kerak, or Guy of Lusignan's push against the Bedouins in Sinai. It's also possible that the tales building up by the time of the biography's writing, l'histoire, could have felt overly fanciful to include for some reason. We know, however, that William came back either in late 1185 or early 1186. Again, interesting as also a bit mysterious parenthesis in his life. In this sense, fulfilling the conventional duty of armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land. I made a video about warfare in the Latin East. We have also a Crusades warfare place for that matter. It's interesting at some point that such a famous figure was there, but his journey was also so quiet. And this is also relevant, almost epoch-making, because, as you understand, this is just 1 year before the July 1187 loss at Athens that I made 2 hours and a half tactical analysis on back in the day, still valid, followed by the fall of Jerusalem. William slipped back into Henry II's service as a reliable leader during the monarch's final upheavals. He immediately granted the broad royal estate of Cartmel in Cumbria and oversight of Heloise, the heir to the Lancaster barony, possibly with an eye toward wedding her to gain northern standing, because the north was quite a turbulent frontier still and a hotbed of revolt at some point. This was true even for the Midlands in general, but still we will see now what happened. However, so bigger marital opportunities loomed for a man of William's reputation. The 1188 raid into Berry that I made just a video about some weeks ago by Philip II Augustus led Henry II to call up William, a letter surviving that drips with irony over his complaints about earlier rewards, promising a match with Dionysia, Lady of Châteauroux, and her lands in Berry as a naturally proper reward for, in fact, a victory to score over the King of France across the sea. Tensions in the field worsened, however, Henry's split with his successor Richard, Count of Poitou, who switched to Philip's side, thus joining the plot against his father's authority. During 1189, as William covered Henry's retreat from the siege at Le Mans to Chinon in the face of brotherly attack, William famously engaged Richard, the Lionheart, in a brief clash, knocking him from his horse. The only documented instance for this other giant in medieval knighthood, then killing the animal on purpose while letting the prince go to emphasize mercy rather than vengeance, an act of deliberate leniency amid brother against brother royal violence, and probably father against brother. This is also relevant for a number of reasons. First of all, it is an act of, bad assery, just like I show you that if I want, I can simply disable you, right? And it's not like, because there is often this notion, we've seen also in different videos about Crusader tactics, etc., that horses were so, which is true, they're very vulnerable in a way, very resilient animals. If they get crippled, they, however, are of no use in combat. But it's not like you can simply disable a warhorse, right? Unless you know exactly where to strike in the right moment. So it requires a set of skills that only William, and not even Richard, debatably, would have. Secondly, killing the notion is accompanied by the ulterior one regarding the fact that in fact war horses would have been vulnerable instead, in that given their cost, just killing them was not considered chivalric, because it was just inflicting such a huge damage that was considered like as if noblemen would have not done it at some point. This is also an argument that defies itself, right? In warfare, you are there to kill to cause the maximum damage, so everything was perfectly coherent within the picture. Naturally, the attack against the rider was considered more important, because even if on foot the knight is a problem, as we've seen, you have also to capture him in some way and so on. So this action was rather just a display of incredible precision and cold blood that Richard would have been unfairly criticized for not having, because the idea was almost a hothead, that he exposed himself too much. Those are two different things. Richard actually had a very cold character himself, and he knew instead very well exactly where to throw himself in the fray, also at the risk of his own life, but choosing exactly the right moment, which at this point in the art of war, in fact, even the intervention of a king was needed still. In any case, on July the 6th, 1189, Henry II passed away at Chinon, worn down by sickness and loss, right? You can imagine also the probably psychophysical exhaustion, a fight also against your own children, etc. Abandoned by relatives. Well, even the mother was even Eleanor was siding with Richard, typically. Henry's favorite was John. Right, and actually John of England was a hell of a ruler, regardless of what people commonly think. And I also voiced that in my video about the Angevins. Henry II's relatives apparently even stole his cloak, except for William's devotion in arranging his entombment at the Fontevraud Abbey, where, as noted in Matthew Paris's Chronica Maiora, Richard's showing up caused a nosebleed from the corpse, like the spirit protesting its betrayer drawing penitent weeping from the successor. But imagine it even from William's perspective, burying the son and then the father of such an illustrious and most powerful house. Upon taking the throne, Richard challenged William's boldness. Naturally, remembering what had happened that day on the battlefield, charging him with attempted murder even, but the knight declared it was mercy by design, claiming he could have slain Richard with ease thanks to his own reputation as well, which is a hell of a statement, which naturally doesn't help hiding the haughtiness here, just like a lower rank slaying princely blood. But he had knighted one already, had buried both that and a king, so it's something relevant here also in a broader providential sense. Richard, ever practical amid crusade needs, pardoned William, viewing his allegiance and skill as essential. Right, Richard had other feuds. We've seen that in the videos about Conrad of Montferrat. We can come back on the same topic at some point. The promise from Henry II of the Strigwil maiden, Isabelle de Clare, a fatherless ward kept in the Tower of London, held firm at this point. In fact, this had already been arranged and Richard simply confirmed it, so that in August of 1189, aged 43 or 44, again, very long knightly youth, William married the 17-year-old Isabel, who lived between 1172 and 1220, circa, we don't hear the precise years, but she was the child of Richard declared, known as Strongbow, who had died in 1176. And was the second Earl of Pembroke and Buckingham, the vanquisher of Leinster, and Aoife MacMorrough, offspring of Leinster's King Diarmait MacMorrough. Additionally, she traced her great-grandparentage through Aoife's mum, More O'Toole, to Robert de Beaumont, the second Earl of Leicester and Count of Moulins, plus his second partner Elizabeth de Vermandois, related to the Capetians. So we're talking in very high nobility in northwestern Europe. Despite the 26-year age difference, as we've seen, the marriage built real fondness, with no signs of extramarital liaison, an unusual thing among the elite at the time. It endowed William with the Earl's rank at Pembroke, effectively until the official regrant in 1199 after the 1154 forfeiture. The lordship of Strigul, a share of the Longueville honour, almost a fourth of Ireland, the huge lordship of Leinster, the by far richest part of the island. If you're interested, I made a video about the earldom of Ulster, and I was just today toying with preparing a video about Leinster, even though I for now stored one about the Dalriata instead, but we'll cover everything. If you're interested in my medieval Ireland playlist, of course you know where to search, as well as Norman bridal portions of the Arbec and Bienfait lordships from the Clare stock, rooted in Normandy's Pays d'Auge near Arbec. So this is a very interesting picture. English, Irish, French seigneuries. An incredibly positive, successful marriage that made William, from a penniless bachelor knight, one of the kingdom's richest, right? He also enhanced his bride's properties. He added layered defenses and a main entrance to Pembroke Castle, drawing on Crusader methods he'd seen in Outre-mer, such as curved turrets and carved-out moats, broadening Chepstow Castle, building Carlisle Castle in 1213, and reorganizing Leinster up to the latter year. The couple raised 5 sons and 5 daughters who reached maturity, their offspring weaving into royal lines, including the English one, via Isabel to the Scottish houses of Bruce and Stuart. We will, if anything, make a video about these, historically and true mode to Plantagenet kings Edward V and Richard III, extending to virtually every English ruler, starting with Henry VIII. So William Marshal, in though female line, is the ancestor, or also the historical royals. When Richard I left for the Third Crusade in 1190, he left behind a governing board that featured William, who aided his sibling John's removal of the Chief Justice William Longchamp in 1191, but soon realized John's goals clashed with the crown's, so he joined 1193 forces of the faithful against him in fights. In spring of 1194, ahead of Richard's homecoming, William's older brother John Marshal the Steward died holding Marlborough Castle for John. Richard, freed after the famous Vienna ransom of Leopold of Austria, passed the inherited marshal role and the family seat at Hampstead Marshal to William, who led drives in Normandy against Philip II, showing unrelenting energy in the process. At age 50, in 1197, while taking Milly Castle, William captured foes himself, prompting Richard's mild scolding. Lord Marshal, it's not really a good thing. It's actually a negative one for a man of such a high rank and of such beautiful prowess that he will get busy in such a matter, led it to the bachelors that had to still gain the fame. This is interesting because he had sort of been a bachelor up to relatively few time before himself. And a reminder of the property fitting high rank, right, as a target of William in that case. As Richard lay dying on April the 6th, 1191 at Toulouse from a crossbow wound, famously enough, he, the dying king, designated William as keeper of Rouen and protector of the royal funds during the gap in rule. A mark of deep confidence. So, again, think about your lifetime, having witnessed this kids growing, being some of the greatest rulers and knights of the era, and letting this sit in together with the realization of your own limits as a knight that, however, were, as we'll see now, still hopefully to be transcended. With John's rise as King of England, we are in the same 1199, William pushed for him over Arthur of Brittany. That was the adolescent boy of John's deceased older brother, Geoffroy Plantagenet, rejecting Arthur's bids even with temptations from the Capetians that naturally were hoping to start another civil war in England on the basis of this dynastic matter. His backing set being key to John's crowning. Right, John had also been close to the Irish possessions of William early in the day, because Henry II had actually given Ireland to John to practice in his early years. Between 1200 and 1203, William directed the defense of Normandy from Capetian strikes, as Philip II chipped away at Angevin lands abroad through blockades and talks. William departed with John's December 1283 pull-out, forsaking the duchy. In the process, this was the ancestral, the paternal land, and this was a pretty painful moment. This is, in fact, the first loss of French possessions, except for basically the Guyenne, before the coming back of 1214, it's Battle of Bouvines, that William lived long enough, especially admirably in a life like his, to witness. Of course, there was a lot of bitterness after the defeat had crested in 1204. There are peace talks with Philip, where William and the Earl of Leicester served as negotiators themselves. John had okayed swearing allegiance to Philip to hold Normandy as a Western Frankish, now French, fief, probably because under Philip Augustus you have the Royaume de France, even the vernacular next to the official Latin, by the way. But Philip demanded sole loyalty. It wasn't too harsh in that moment. He had, after all, gained most of what he wanted. This, however, was disapproved by John, and when William went along with it, John exploited enrage at court, breaking their bond this way. All right. So William naturally showed, as we've seen, an important degree of self-awareness and sort of even volitive character, yet against the king. And think to have a man of such stature, even as a ruler, under your command, it's not easy to come. There's a specific weight in this knightly hero and legion that is deeply felt at the time. There's a charisma, a deserved divine blessing that enshrines him in an aura of almost indefeasibility and touchability, even by a monarch. Purges of Irish lords in 1207 hit William himself, because these are also Anglo-Irish barons, alongside, in fact, the Browse and Lacy families. Heading to Leinster, William met at 1208, summons back and public shaming, as John's Irish official Mailer Fitzhenry burned the town of New Ross as a monarchic memento, the pressure on William. Isabel's stand against Mailer brought William racing back, ending the raid itself. That's how close John had arrived to William's possessions. The 1210 clash between Browse and Lacy brought fresh strains, but William held on, strengthening Leinster until the 1213 rising of Carlow and remapping of the holdings. A call from the Crown arrived in 1212 over troubles in Wales. With goodwill renewed between the two sides by 1213 for a return to England of William, even with strains that included John's despotic rule, pushing barons away through heavy taxes, legal wrongs, and a church ban, even though I actually explain how all these things can be contextualized and properly understood as part of a successful policy from John's side. William kept his oath amid the noble uprising that peaked with the Magna Carta's agreement at Runnymede on June the 15th, 1215. This is interesting because regardless of the possible motivations, there's still an idea that of loyalty to the crown and also general, superiority of William to any other knight, to any other man in the kingdom that naturally tied him to the crown itself. So it's not like rebellious barons were necessarily William's cup of tea per se, right? And this makes William standing as one of the rare earls who didn't waver on that occasion, signing on as guarantor alongside his son William and backers such as William, Earl of Salisbury, and the spouses of Miles, Roger, and Hugh Bigot, committing to uphold provisions that protected free men from random arrests, banishments, or rulings without equals in the custom of the land. Thus, respecting hearing the baronial standpoint and sort of providing with a royal guarantee, essentially, of respect of the same Magna Carta. On his deathbed, on October the 19th, 1216, at Newark, John handed the task of safeguarding the throne for the 9-year-old Henry III to William. I made an entire video about Henry III's reign, so you can see also how what were the circumstances, really. John was still revolt after revolt, actually succeeding. He simply died of illness during a campaign, and Henry III would mostly narrate a sense of withdrawal, just maintaining peace, because he had been traumatized by the events of his father's reign. William managed John's funeral rites at Worcester Cathedral. This is striking, again, considering the generational, as we've seen, succession. Like, this guy was older than the children of Henry II, and yet basically buried them all, right? On November the 11th, 1216, at Gloucester, a gathering of faithful barons, the holdovers from John's supporters, chose William, that by this point was almost 70, as protector. Literally, rector, regis, et regni, which is an incredible title, especially in properly in traditional sense, because it's the holder, basically, of, say, he who basically maintains straight both the king and the kingdom as such, the regnum, intended probably in a sacred fashion. So he was understood as almost a metaphysical figure that could basically maintain the institutional order of the realm through his own sheer prestige. Like, this was probably the visots, the grizzled veteran who had seen it all before and that knew how to stand as a rock, unwavering, as an overseer of the king and the realm. And regent in this function for Henry III, the young Henry III, waging in the process also the first Baron's War against France's Prince Louis VIII and his insurgent allies in England with energy that defied his ears. This is really impressive from a psychophysical point of view. William was not the only one who sort of still went at tournament. We know some Austrian knights, like even in their 80s. But the burden of this political situation being always on the forefront, right, holding the system in a intensely and now almost archaic and old-fashioned way, still, like, he embodied the soul of chivalry in an extraordinary fashion. William's approach, by the way, and here we see him de facto as a head of state, emphasized moderation and negotiation, aiming for the stability of Henry II's day, back in the moment of glory, the peak of the Angevin so-called empire. It was William who renewed the Magna Carta in 1216 and again in 1225, adding his mark as a signing lord, with versions softening John's original yields to foster calm. All right, quite delicate moment, but one that in fact was managed thanks to William himself. There is the February 1217 blockade of Dover, coupled with Hubert Burr's sea victory in the Dover Strait that successfully broke the French supply lines. During the Civil War, William led the charge at the fore of the battle line, the Second Battle of Lincoln. We will see this in our battle analysis based on primary sources. On May the 20th, 1217, scattering the foe. So one of the highest, knights were awaiting for chances like this, like much better than dying in the ditch of some moat. And here, hopefully, being carried away, like under the wing, even as that of this manifestation of the Imperium that William was. All right, it was a very strong sense of loyalty, of fervent devotion in this knightly culture. William was also in the thick of the scrum at Lincoln Castle, his fury as a man in his 70s, securing the win by killing the 20-something Thomas, the Count de Perche, was at the head of the French cavalry. So this is extraordinary, and you can imagine the human type here. As he led siege to Louis in London, he offered broad terms in September 1217, guaranteed passage to ships seen by some as too easy but wise in statesmanship, speeding the French withdrawal out of knightly mercy. This was one of the darkest hours of England, and yet one of the sort of underrated attempts at conquest, a moment here of great power of the Carpathians over the English after Bouvines. There was sort of regard for enemy views, careful diplomacy. Henry III would perhaps unjustly call this disloyalty later. Yet it can be seen that in hindsight that it actually preserved the integrity of England, the process. The exit of papal envoy Pandulf Verraccio in 1218 made William the lone regent until 1219 against a backdrop of church disputes. The Archbishop of Canterbury angling for control of Pembroke after his passing. In early 1219, his sturdy health from a lifetime, however, gave out to ongoing sickness and discomfort. You can imagine all the trauma that a body passing through those vicissitudes would receive. That's a magnificent soul that managed to inform such resilience. By March, where his end neared, Imagine all the people we've seen dying in his position and how, right? You know when you're going to. And he left the Tower of London for his Caversham estate, summoning lords, Henry III, Pandulph, then the Chief Justice Hubert de Burgh, and Winchester's Bishop Peter de Roche, Henry's official tutor at that point, turning down the bishop's push for regency under the legate's watch, wary of the great lord's schemes. Honoring his vow from Outremer, he took up the Templar's white robe, bearing the red cross for aid, ad succurrendum, clad in it on his deathbed. On May the 14th, 1219, at Caversham, I made a video explaining the Templars' vests' meaning behind this in a theological sense. William passed away surrounded by relatives and old allies, Jean d'Urly among them. Interestingly, he lamented the clergy's failure to grasp the ethics of knighthood, the soul of chivalry, like the eternal contrast of, say, imperium holders being above the church, against what was the priestly opinion at this point, especially after the papal victory in the investiture controversy, right? And you know that the Templars were also likely connected with the preservation of some more ancestral way to self-sacrifice in holy combat and the achievement of a divine level of power, at least attentively, that would have basically retaken any space that the church at some point had been sharing with the empire. And again, it's not like the church did not deserve what it had, because there is no other source of power but God. So if anything, it was a shortcoming of the imperium. But men like William evidently thought that a greater clarity and settlement of the matter was needed in order to achieve also, like for the other knights, as the example, he had been that level of power, and that naturally was also controversial in already the Europe of the time. However, remember, these were the men properly brought up with the Arthurian, with the Carolingian cycle. I mean, the Germanic epos, these were really cultivating all a set of traditions passed down orally at some point. Think about Master Eckhart, different. We know that there was this esoteric knowledge passed down through specifically scientific fashion, and however hidden from the most sort of open, straightforward sort of ecclesiastical allowances, and that was, however, mostly naturally just maintained by the knights and their frequented literacy, just as a way of life rather than something you had to simply write down. On his deathbed, William admitted to seize no fewer than 500 knights, as we were saying before, including their weapons, mounts, and equipment, voicing regret to the group, begging it not to block his redemption. In fact, his motto was Dieu aide le Marshal, that is to say, God help the Marshal, matching his coat of arms, divided vertically gold and green, with a red lion across it, as you can see also in the pictures that I used here. As his will directed, he was laid to rest in London's Temple Church, and everybody knows his tomb being still there. His funeral train receiving tribute from Francis King Philip II Augustus, who was yet another, imperium holder. I mean, he had literally officiated, matching like the overlapping royal and sacerdotal power, the mass on the day of Bouvines, as we've seen also in other videos. We'll come back on the French imperial mystique. King of France, who, upon hearing of the death raised a glass to his formidable adversary through Guillaume de Bar, hailing him as the meilleur chevalier du monde, hence the state by the King of France, and echoing into eternity. Isabel died in 1220, as we've seen, circa, by the way, the offspring of William and Isabel, all of whom lived to adulthood, which was very rare, as child mortality, especially in the early years, but throughout basically also adolescence, was notoriously pretty high. Normally 1/3 of kids died before reaching adulthood. And a mark here of some likely genetic soundness, as we've seen probably from both sides, included 5 sons who produced no lawful children. However, it's difficult to be up to such a great father's figure, causing the Marshal Baron, in fact, to fade after 1 generation only, with lands split among the husbands of the daughters mostly. That's how it had happened also for William and with Isabel. And drawing schemes from Canterbury as well after death. William the Younger, these are the children, like 1190-1231, 2nd Earl of Pembroke, took as wife Alice of Bethune, followed by Eleanor Plantagenet, 1215-1275, on April the 23rd, 1224, daughter of King John, and later spouse to Simon V de Montfort, bearing no children, however. Then you have Richard, 1191-1234, 3rd Earl, who gained Longueville and died from a battle injury at Kilkelly in Ireland, leaving no heirs. The knightly lifestyle continued. This is not a moment in history where you really see an end in this aristocracy. Then you have Gilbert, 1194 or 1197, died 1241, who shifted from clergy to 4th Earl in hopes of heirs, and that perished in a riding accident, instead childless. Walter/Gautier, 1196 or 1199 to 1245, 5th Earl, wed Margaret de Lacy, 2nd Countess of Lincoln and daughter of Hugh de Cavalier, 3rd Earl of Chester, with no issue. Anselm/Anso, roughly 1208 to 1245, 6th Earl. They also all died pretty young. Espoused Maud de Bohun, child of Humphrey de Bohun, 2nd Earl of Hereford, without successors. The girls, Maud/Mathilde, 1192, 1194, 1248. All in the 40s they died. Incredible. I mean, they lived up to their own 40s, 50s, but still. She married Hugh Bigot, 3rd Earl of Norfolk, then William de Varenne, 5th Earl of Surrey, on October the 13th, 1225, and also Walter de Dunstanville. Then you have Isabel, 1200-1240, who on October the 9th, 1217, with Gilbert de Clare, 5th Earl of Hertford and 6th of Gloucester, followed by Richard of Cornwall, brother to Henry III, interestingly enough. Count of Cornwall and King of the Romans. I made a video about not him, but properly the interregnum and the tete-a-tete with Alphonse of Castile. Then you have Sybil or Sibyl. We'll see here all the names from the family, from the kings. That's obviously how William would mention them. Sibyl, 1201, 1240, possibly 1245. She united with William the Fair, 5th Earl of Derby. Ivor, Ev, 1203, 1246. Hitched to William de Bruce, Lord of Brecknock and Abergavenny, who died 1230 in Wales, and through her the ancestor of Jane Seymour, then Joan or Jeanne, 1210, maybe 1235. She wed Varan de Montchensey, the Lord of Swanscombe, producing Jean de Montchensey, who married William de Valence, of Lusignan. He would be really important at the court of Henry the Third, and passed on the Pembroke's line. Via Isabel's connection to the Clare, William tied ancestrally to the Scottish crowns of Bruce and Stuart, plus the English Angevin Tudor lines, his enduring mark serving, in fact, as a pivot in the feudal rise of the 12th and 13th centuries, from spare son to regent, captured in glowing depiction of l'histoire drawn from the earliest stories at the request of the heir, shedding light on the mindset of chivalry, which is a big mystery for especially the activation, say, of transcendental capacity, still deeply believed by these men. The upheavals of the politics, the society of the time, and how virtue turned hardship, of course, as always, into greatness amid a fading code of warriors that were still, in fact, in charge as a militarized establishment of the system and carrying all the weight on their shoulders. This magnificent vision of them charging, their battle cries, shattering shields, breaking lances, passing to the sword, with this relentless faith in their commitment, fighting and die, just as William magnificently epitomized with his existence. So it's really interesting to really look at these characters, even just from probably a biographical point of view. Like, what did they go through, right? Of course, a video like this is somehow a synthesis, right? It's not going to answer all the questions, but it's relevant that we can at least start looking at these profiles of some of the greatest rulers, leaders, warriors, fighters, etc., in ways that perhaps will sort of complete our perspective on Schwerpunkt. It was always, I could make a video on how or why that happened, but basically stuck to either a territorial and a more systemic kind of analysis, aside from the evenemential, the spiritual, right, the symbolical, the also different political, social analysis as well. So it was really complete up to this element. If anything, we have to talk more about campaigns, we have to talk more about individuals. That's what really shows what the dynamics of this world were about. And I think that this is really the only way you can tell such a story in history for the better understanding. I also am glad, as always, to make more videos about medieval England, because it feels, from one side, that I really make a few. And I'm looking here at the playlist, Medieval England 63. It's too few, especially too few high and late medieval England warfare evenemential stuff. If you look at medieval Britain, for example, alone, there's more. We really did as a whole for the region. Medieval Britain and Ireland, 87. Medieval British warfare, 45. So, yeah, I mean, you will find definitely what we need to an extent, but it also requires a much deeper dive, and I hope that, especially in this end of 2025, we're going to cover an importantly large amount of content in this regard. From the poll that I launched a couple of months ago, not just a month ago, something, I realized that you want essentially mostly medieval history, which I think I can check how much, at least more, because that was the question. Eventually would pass to something like, what do you like the most, rather? And with a 41% which is, interestingly enough, not necessarily the highest. But we have a 27% ancient history that, however, overall is surpassed by the sum of modern contemporary. Modern 19%, however, contemporary 13%. So, again, it's fairly, as I already commented on this, pretty balanced proportion of what we have done so far already. So it's also relatively unsurprising if YouTube's algorithm was to effectively work after all. In any case, really need to do more, and in a way that really blends in perfectly with the spirit of the channel, what we have already covered. All right, it's a challenge, but step by step we're heading toward that. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.